I am genuinely concerned for Pope Francis' well-being. You know, with all the remarks he has been making lately, it sounds as if he's getting more and more enemies every day. It is enough to look at some of those Catholic websites, especially those self-proclaimed very orthodox bloggers, to realize how much they hate his guts. Because the more open-minded Pope Francis appears to be, the more hateful those bloggers and ultra-conservative self-proclaimed defenders of faith appear to be. So please join me as we pray for Pope Francis' safety and good health, for it would not be the first time when the Pope mysteriously dies in his sleep. It wouldn't be the first time when the Borgias got active once again. You know, maybe they don't have the same last name anymore, but the Borgias of the papal court are still well and very much alive. So the more I observe this unusual Pope, the more I'm praying for his safety. Now, his scandalous lifestyle began at the very moment of his election. Doug, who was secretary back then, and I were watching on our computer who will appear on the balcony. And there he comes out, simply wearing his cassock. Now compare his pictures from the pictures of Benedict XVI, and his regalia clothes on. Francis wears simply his cassock, no other vestment, no other royal signs and symbols, and to the surprise of all, myself included, before he gives blessing, he asks people to bless him. Now that was a shock. It never ever happened before. For the Pope to ask people to bless him before he grants his very first papal blessing? Scandal. Huge scandal. And he did not wear any of those 17th century cappa magna or other beautiful royal vestments. So some people were unhappy the very first hour. It got worse on Holy Thursday. Yeah, much worse. Imagine that the Pope usually washed the feet of the bishops and the priests at the Last Supper celebration on Holy Thursday. So this Pope did something doubly confusing. He went to a prison to wash the feet of prisoners, and two of the people who got their feet washed were women. Women. Did you hear that? The Pope actually realized that there are women in the church. And a number of years ago, I remember there was a big fight in this church when one priest refused to wash the feet of women because he said it's not Roman Catholic tradition. And he was right, actually. In the Roman Catholic Church, women don't get their feet washed. You know why? Because the implications are dangerous. It would mean that perhaps there were women at the Last Supper, right? That perhaps women could be priests. Oh my God! You see how gestures are important? Because each gesture has a symbolic implication. So people got really, really mad at Pope Francis after Holy Thursday. You could see that on some of the ultra-right-wing Orthodox websites. They were going crazy. And then he gave an interview in, I think, Florence on Milan newspaper. His interviewer was an atheist reporter to whom he declared, just off the cuff, "Oh sure, atheists can be saved in heaven as well." I mean, this Pope is suicidal. Why would he say such things? God can save even the atheists? You see why I'm praying for the Pope? You need to pray for him too. The Borgias are well. And then came another interview, probably the most scandalous so far, on his flight from Brazil back to Rome. Among many subjects, one of the questions was about his close aide, who was openly gay priest, to which Pope Francis made a comment, "So he is gay, so what? Who am I to judge?" I was surprised the plane did not collapse right there. For a pope to say such words, "So what? Get over it." I mean, really. Pope Benedict made a policy that no seminarian can be ordained if he has deeply seated homosexual tendencies. And God knows what that means, deeply seated. So it wasn't 5 years later that Pope Francis says, "So what? Who am I to judge it?" 5 years can make a big difference in the ambience and the atmosphere in the church. He really either is suicidal or he wants to change this church for better. And 2 days ago, another news came out from Rome. I don't know if you read it yet. Pope Francis is planning third ever extraordinary synod of the church, which means a small council. Unfortunately or fortunately, there are so many bishops right now that they wouldn't all fit in the Basilica of St. Peter's. So he is not calling for the big council, but he is calling for an extraordinary synod to discuss the issues of Christian and Catholic families. And on Friday it was reported, listen to that, it was reported on Friday that the Pope sent a questionnaire, a survey, to all the bishops asking them or ordering them to get the answers to these questions from lay parishioners in their diocese. Now that in and of itself is a revolution. To ask lay people for advice, that is a revolution. Now listen to the questions. The main theme of this coming synod will be the life of Christian families. So one of the major issues is, should the divorced and remarried Catholics be readmitted to Holy Communion? The Pope is asking lay people what they think. What is he thinking? Question number 2, should the Church reconsider the absolute ban on artificial contraception in married families? What the heck is he thinking? 98% of Catholics know the answer to this question. And another question is, how should the Church react, and perhaps should the Church change its teaching on the issue of same-sex marriage? I mean, these questions could not be asked out loud 5 years ago. If any bishop in good standing had asked such questions 5 years ago, he would be sacked a day later. And today we have a pope who is asking out loud these kinds of questions. Perhaps 5 or 10 or 15 or 50 years from now, people will say, you know what? Pope Francis saw what St. Stanislaus did, and he followed their lead. Perhaps. But we don't need the credit. We need to have a pope like this one who will live long enough to bring these reforms to fulfillment. But I am bringing all these tidbits of news and information because there is a direct connection with the gospel passage today. Jesus goes to a house of Zacchaeus, who is publicly known as a sinner. He's a tax collector. And tax collectors are like IRS agents, but much, much worse. Because tax collectors back then took a bunch of money for the government and an equal bunch of money to their own pocket. So he was a sinner. He was a cause for public scandal because, to make things worse, he was collecting money for the Roman Empire. So he was a traitor. He was collecting money for the occupying army. And yet Jesus goes to his house, sits at his table, and eats with him what would make him ritually unclean, according to the Jewish laws. So when people grumble, and I love that word, people grumbled. Today they would say, people were twittering how scandalous this is. How dare he? Is Jesus suicidal? Hashtag. So, you know what Jesus says? Basically the same reaction as Pope Francis had on his flight from Brazil to Rome. Jesus says, so what? Get over it. Who am I to judge? Who am I to judge that he's a tax collector? Who am I to judge that he's a sinner? Two great people said that, Jesus and Pope Francis. When you were prepared for your first communion, and yes, I know it was just a few months ago, but try to go back in your memory, your first communion classes. Before that, you had to prepare for your first confession, remember that? Going to that box, your knees trembling, sweating like crazy, forgetting what to say. But an integral part of preparation for confession is examination of conscience. And your Sunday school teachers, or the nun or the priest who prepared you for your first communion should have taught you how to examine your conscience. Which means you sit down and think, what have I done right and what have I done wrong since my last confession? So you make mental notes. Don't cheat on my husband again. Don't steal from my boss. Be good to your parents. That's what examination of conscience is. You examine, you judge your own conscience. You make a list of pros and cons and focus on the cons, and then you confess them at the confessional. But notice, please, that it is self-examination of conscience. Nobody has ever taught you to examine the conscience of your neighbor. Nobody has ever taught you to examine the conscience of your spouse, of someone that you meet every day at work, or someone that you meet every Sunday at church. Examination of conscience applies only to yourself. You are called to judge your own life. You are called to examine your own moral choices. You are not called to judge your neighbor. You are not called to examine his or her conscience. If the Pope can say, "Who am I to judge?" why can't we?